Lucy Chen worked endless shifts at a small Vermont diner, stretching every dollar between rent and nursing school textbooks. Each morning, she watched a homeless veteran brave the brutal New England winter, his military bearings still visible, despite his ragged clothes. With only $95 in tips, saved for her own Thanksgiving dinner, Lucy made a choice that would impact not just her life, but would eventually touch the hearts of veterans and communities across America. Her simple act of kindness was about to uncover a story of heroism, loss, and redemption that would change everything. Today, I'm excited to share an incredible story that reminds us how a single moment of compassion can reveal extraordinary truths and heal wounds we never knew existed. In the small town of Millbrook, Vermont, where maple trees lined the streets and everyone knew each other's names, the Maple Grove Diner stood as a warm refuge against the bitter cold. For Lucy Chen, it was more than just a workplace. It was her stepping stone to a dream. Just 2 more years, she would whisper to herself during pre-dawn shifts, counting tips that would hopefully add up to another semester of nursing school. The diner itself was nothing fancy. Worn leather booths, slightly crooked photos of local landmarks on wood-paneled walls, and the constant aroma of Maria Rodriguez's secret recipe maple-spiced coffee. But it was home to a stream of regulars who knew Lucy by name and sometimes slipped her extra tips with whispered encouragements about her studies. "Order up, Lucy," Maria would call out, her voice carrying over the clinking of plates and murmur of conversations. "Table 6 needs their usual." Lucy would navigate the busy morning rush with practiced ease, her red apron pockets heavy with her textbook notes, studying whenever she could steal a moment between refills and orders. But lately, something had been drawing her attention, away from both her studies and her duties. It started 3 weeks ago, when the first frost of November painted the diner windows with delicate patterns. That's when she first noticed him. Tall and straight-backed despite his circumstances, carefully picking through the diner's dumpster in the early morning hours. What caught Lucy's eye wasn't just his actions, but his bearing. Even in layers of worn clothes, there was something unmistakable about how he carried himself. The way he stood at perfect attention when trucks passed by, how he unconsciously squared his shoulders when meeting someone's gaze. But it was his eyes that struck her most, clear blue and alert, carrying a weight that seemed to speak of battles fought far from this quiet Vermont town. "That's just Tom," Beth, another waitress, told her during a quiet moment. "Started showing up about a month ago. Maria says to just ignore him, says he's scaring customers away." But Lucy couldn't ignore him, especially not after she saw him one morning, standing in the snow, quietly saluting as a military funeral procession passed by the diner. Something in that moment struck a chord deep within Lucy. Her own grandfather had served, though he rarely spoke of it. Before he passed, he'd made her promise something. "Always remember, Lucy, that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who need help the most. They're just too proud to ask." The morning shifts became a quiet routine. Lucy would arrive at 5 a.m., and there Tom would be, huddled in the alley, trying to stay warm. She began leaving cups of coffee near the dumpster, pretending not to notice when they disappeared. Sometimes she'd catch his quiet, "Thank you, Mom," drifting on the morning breeze. Each day, Lucy added $1 or $2 to her Thanksgiving fund, tucked away in an old cookie tin in her apartment. $95 she counted one cold November evening, planning her own modest holiday meal. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for a small turkey and some sides, her first real Thanksgiving dinner since moving to Vermont for school. But that night, as temperatures plunged below freezing and weather reports warned of an approaching storm, Lucy saw Tom trying to find shelter in the diner's doorway, his thin jacket offering little protection against the bitter Vermont cold. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind, and she looked down at her tip money, knowing what she had to do, not yet realizing that this decision would set in motion events that would reveal an extraordinary story of valor, loss, and redemption that would touch hearts across the nation. The more Lucy watched Tom, the more her curiosity and concern grew. Unlike other homeless people who sometimes passed through Millbrook, Tom had routines that spoke of military precision. Each morning, at exactly 0600 hours, Lucy had noticed his use of military time when she once heard him muttering to himself. He would carefully fold his worn blanket into perfect hospital corners. His few possessions were always arranged with meticulous care behind the diner: a threadbare backpack, a dog-eared paperback book, and what looked like an old military canteen. "He's been here 3 weeks now," Maria commented one morning, her usual warm smile tinged with worry. "Most move on after a few days." The diner owner had begun leaving the heating vent in the back of the building running longer than necessary, though she never mentioned it. Lucy noticed how Maria would sometimes place day-old muffins in a bag near the back door, pretending she was just disposing of extras. It was during the quiet lull between breakfast and lunch that Lucy began piecing together fragments of Tom's story. Sometimes when the diner wasn't busy, he would sit on the bench across the street, and his habits told their own tale. He would snap to attention whenever military vehicles from the nearby National Guard base passed by. During one particularly cold morning, Lucy noticed how he methodically massaged his left leg, a gesture her grandfather used to do with his own war injury. The regular customers had mixed reactions to their unusual neighbor. Old Mr. Peterson, who came in every morning for his black coffee and wheat toast, would nod respectfully to Tom, one veteran recognizing another. But others weren't so kind. "He shouldn't be here," Lucy overheard Mrs. Harrison whisper to her friend. "It's bad for business. What kind of veteran ends up like that?" Those words stirred something in Lucy. During her break, she found herself walking to the bench where Tom sat. Up close, she could see the scars on his hands, marks of a life lived in service. "Would you like some hot soup?" she asked, holding out a steaming cup. "Maria's special today." Tom looked up, and for a moment, Lucy saw something flash in his eyes, pride wrestling with hunger. "Thank you, Mom," he said finally, his voice carrying the kind of authority that commanded respect, even through its weariness. "But I'm afraid I can't pay." "It's getting cold," Lucy said simply, setting the soup down beside him. As she turned to leave, she heard him say something that stopped her in her tracks. "Echo Company, 3rd Battalion," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "We never left anyone behind." Later that afternoon, Lucy noticed something she hadn't seen before. As Tom carefully ate the soup, his sleeve pulled back to reveal a faded tattoo, a Marine Corps emblem, alongside what looked like coordinates. She also caught a glimpse of something hanging around his neck, tucked carefully under his layers of clothes. Dog tags, she realized, though he quickly concealed them when he noticed her looking. That evening, as Lucy counted her tips and added to her Thanksgiving fund, she overheard 2 customers talking about a news story. "Can you believe it?" one said. "That Marine unit from Desert Storm, the one that saved all those people. They're having some kind of reunion next month, trying to locate all their members." The conversation faded as the customers left, but Lucy's mind was racing. She thought about Tom's military bearing, the coordinates tattooed on his arm, the way he spoke about Echo Company. There was more to his story, much more than met the eye. But as she watched him through the window, huddled against the increasing cold, she realized that right now, his past mattered less than his present needs. The forecast for Thanksgiving week was grim, record-breaking cold temperatures and a potential snowstorm. Lucy looked at her tip money again, then at Tom's figure outside. She remembered her grandfather's words about strength and pride, about how sometimes the bravest people are the last to ask for help. What she didn't know was that her next decision would not only change Tom's life, but would unlock a story of heroism that had been buried for decades. The week before Thanksgiving brought a bitter cold that seemed to seep into the very bones of Millbrook. Lucy's small acts of kindness toward Tom had become part of her daily routine, though she tried to be discreet about them. A cup of coffee here, a warm muffin there, small gestures that seemed to build an unspoken trust between them. But it was a chance encounter during one of her late-night shifts that would deepen their connection in unexpected ways. It was nearly closing time, and the diner was empty, except for a few truckers nursing their coffee. The local news played quietly on the old TV mounted in the corner, running a special about veterans struggling with PTSD. Lucy noticed how Tom, sitting on his usual bench outside, seemed to be watching through the window, his face illuminated by the diner's neon sign. "My grandfather served in Vietnam," Lucy said softly, bringing a fresh cup of coffee to his bench after her shift. This time, instead of just leaving it, she sat down beside him, pulling her coat tight against the cold. He never talked about it much, but some nights I'd hear him pacing, remembering. Tom's hands wrapped around the warm cup, his fingers bearing the telltale roughness of someone who'd seen combat. "Your grandfather," he said after a long moment. "Which unit?" 25th Infantry Division, Lucy replied, remembering the patch she'd found among her grandfather's things after he passed. "He was in Kuchi." Something shifted in Tom's expression. A recognition, a shared understanding. "Tough territory," he said quietly. "We all carried different weights home from different wars, but the weight, that's the same." He paused, looking down at his coffee. "Your grandfather would be proud, you know. Kindness like yours. It's rarer than courage in combat." Lucy noticed how he meticulously arranged his few possessions beside him. The backpack positioned at exactly the same angle it had been every day. The book, she could now see it was a worn copy of Gates of Fire, placed precisely on top. These weren't just the habits of someone who'd served. They were anchors to a past life, a way of maintaining dignity and discipline even in the hardest circumstances. As if reading her thoughts, Tom straightened his shoulders. "Routine keeps you human," he said. "Even when everything else is gone, you still have your training, your discipline." His hand unconsciously went to his dog tags, and for the first time, Lucy caught a glimpse of a medal ribbon tucked alongside them. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion inside the diner. A group of young men had come in, clearly drunk and rowdy. Through the window, Lucy could see Maria trying to handle the situation. She stood to go help, but Tom's next words stopped her. "Echo Company," he said suddenly, his voice distant, as if speaking from memory. "We were in the desert during the storm. Not the weather kind. Operation Desert Storm. There was this night." He trailed off, his eyes focused on something far away. "Sometimes the storms inside last longer than the ones we fought through." Lucy sat back down, the rowdy customers forgotten. This was the most Tom had ever spoken, and something told her it was important. She noticed his hand trembling slightly as he reached for something in his pocket. A folded piece of paper, worn at the creases. "They gave us medals," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the real honor was in saving them. 38 civilians caught in the crossfire. We got them out, every last one. The coordinates are..." He caught himself, tucking the paper away quickly. But that's ancient history now. The diner's door chimed as Maria successfully ushered the troublemakers out. In that moment, Lucy saw something she hadn't noticed before. A small symbol, inked on Tom's wrist, partially hidden by his sleeve. It looked like a unit insignia, but before she could get a better look, he pulled his sleeve down. "You should head home," Tom said, his walls going back up. "It's getting late, and the temperature's dropping." But as Lucy stood to leave, he added softly, "Thank you for the coffee and for listening. Your grandfather taught you well." That night, as Lucy lay in her small apartment above the bookstore, she couldn't stop thinking about Tom's words, about the medal ribbon she'd glimpsed, about the coordinates he'd mentioned. She pulled out her phone and began searching for information about Echo Company and Desert Storm, but most of the records were classified or incomplete. What she did find, however, was a small news article about a heroic rescue operation, though the details were vague. The unit involved had saved dozens of civilians while under heavy fire, but the names of the Marines involved were never released for security reasons. The only identifying detail was a set of coordinates that matched a pattern similar to Tom's. Tattoo. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Lucy's mind was filled with questions. Who was Tom, really? What was the full story behind Echo Company? And why would someone who had performed such heroic deeds end up on the streets of a small Vermont town? She had no way of knowing that the answers would come soon enough, and that they would change not just Tom's life, but the lives of countless others. The day before Thanksgiving arrived with a sense of urgency in the air. The morning news warned of an approaching winter storm system, one of the worst in recent Vermont history. Lucy arrived at her early shift to find the diner unusually busy, filled with travelers trying to beat the weather home for the holiday. $95, Lucy whispered to herself as she prepared for her shift, touching the envelope in her apron pocket. The money represented more than just a holiday meal. It was 3 weeks of careful saving, of putting aside every extra tip, of walking instead of taking the bus to save on fare. She had it all planned out. A small turkey, potatoes, cranberry sauce, and even a tiny pumpkin pie. It would be her first real Thanksgiving dinner since moving to Vermont for nursing school. But as she looked through the frost-covered windows, at Tom's usual spot, her heart sank. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees overnight, and the weather report predicted it would plunge even lower. Tom sat on his bench, more huddled than usual, his breath visible in the frigid air. Even from inside, Lucy could see him shivering. "He won't survive this storm out there," Maria said quietly, coming up beside Lucy. The diner owner's face was creased with worry. "I tried to convince him to go to the shelter in Burlington, but..." She trailed off, both of them knowing that Tom's pride and military bearing made accepting such help difficult. Throughout her morning shift, Lucy found herself increasingly distracted. Every time the door opened, letting in a blast of Arctic air, she thought about Tom outside. She remembered her grandfather's words about strength and pride, about how the ones who need help the most are often the last to ask for it. During her break, Lucy counted her savings again, spreading the bills out on the break room table. $95, not a fortune, but enough to make a difference. She thought about her own empty apartment, about the Thanksgiving she had planned. Then she thought about Tom, about the metal ribbon she'd glimpsed, about his story of saving 38 civilians in the desert storm. "Your grandfather would be proud," Tom had said about her small acts of kindness. What would her grandfather say now? She closed her eyes, remembering his voice. "Sometimes, Lucy, the right thing and the hard thing are the same thing." The decision weighed heavily on her as she served the lunch rush. Every time she put a plate of hot food in front of a customer, she thought about Tom outside. The wind had picked up, rattling the diner's old windows, and the first few snowflakes had begun to fall. "Did you hear about the homeless shelter in Burlington?" Lucy overheard one customer say. "They're full up already, with the storm coming." Another customer chimed in. "The forecast says it's going to be the coldest Thanksgiving in 50 years. They're calling it the Arctic blast." Lucy's hand went to her apron pocket, feeling the envelope with her savings. She thought about her nursing textbooks, about the sections on hypothermia she'd recently studied, the symptoms, the risks, the potentially fatal consequences. As a future nurse, how could she stand by and watch someone suffer when she had the means to help? During a quiet moment, she saw Tom attempting to warm his hands over a steam vent. His normally straight military posture was bent against the cold, and she noticed he was favoring his left leg more than usual, the old war injury likely aching in the brutal weather. "Lucy, honey," called Mrs. Peterson, one of her regular customers. "You seem distracted today." Lucy managed to smile as she refilled Mrs. Peterson's coffee. "Just thinking about Thanksgiving," she replied honestly. The elderly woman glanced out the window at Tom, then back at Lucy. "You know," she said softly, "my Harold was a Marine too. Proud man. Sometimes too proud to ask for help, even when he needed it most." She pressed an extra $5 into Lucy's hand. "Do what your heart tells you, dear." As her shift progressed, Lucy found herself making mental calculations. The grocery store would be closing early for the holiday. If she was going to do something, it would have to be soon. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with the snow beginning to stick to the ground and the wind picking up strength. She thought about her own Thanksgiving plans, or lack thereof. No family nearby, most of her friends gone home for the holiday. Her tiny apartment would feel empty, even with a home-cooked meal. Meanwhile, Tom would be out here, alone in the deadly cold, on a day meant for gratitude and sharing. The decision crystallized in her mind when she saw Tom pull out his worn copy of Gates of Fire, the book about Spartan warriors and sacrifice. Here was a man who had sacrificed everything for others, who had saved 38 lives in a desert storm, now fighting a different kind of battle against the cold and his own demons. Lucy pulled out her phone, looking up the grocery store's holiday hours. They would be closing in exactly 2 hours, just enough time to get there and back before the worst of the storm hit. Her hand went to the envelope in her pocket one last time, feeling the weight of the decision. She hadn't known when she started saving these tips that they would become a choice between her own comfort and someone else's survival. Lucy's decision came with a clarity that surprised her. As the afternoon light began to fade and the snow fell more heavily, she asked Maria for an early break from her shift. The diner owner took one look at her determined expression and nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Take whatever time you need, honey," Maria said, pressing a $20 bill into Lucy's hand. "And Lucy, there's some extra blankets in the storage room, the ones we keep for emergencies." Her meaningful look said everything words couldn't. The local grocery store, Miller's Market, was almost empty when Lucy arrived, most people having already done their Thanksgiving shopping. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the nearly empty shelves, but Lucy moved with purpose. Into her cart went a medium-sized turkey, potatoes, stuffing mix, cranberry sauce, and vegetables. She added a thick fleece blanket from the seasonal aisle, some heavy-duty hand warmers, and, remembering Tom's sweet tooth from the way he looked at Maria's maple pastries, a fresh-baked pumpkin pie. At the checkout, Lucy carefully counted out her savings. The total came to $92.47, leaving her with just $2 and change. Mr. Miller, the store owner, watched her count out the bills, including the 20 from Maria. "Cooking for a crowd?" he asked kindly, noting the contents of her cart. "Something like that," Lucy replied, thinking of Tom sitting alone in the cold. As Mr. Miller rang up her purchases, he accidentally forgot to charge her for the blanket and hand warmers. "Must be a computer error," he said with a wink, having seen Tom outside his store on many mornings. "Happy Thanksgiving, Lucy." The wind had picked up considerably by the time Lucy made her way back to the diner, struggling with the bags. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees, and the weather report on her phone warned of an approaching Arctic front. Through the swirling snow, she could see Tom still at his usual spot, now barely visible in the growing darkness. Lucy's hands trembled as she used the diner's kitchen to heat the food, grateful for Maria's permission to use the facilities after hours. The smell of roasting turkey filled the back of the diner, and she carefully packed everything into insulated containers from Maria's supply. She added paper plates, plastic utensils, and several bottles of water. As she worked, Lucy caught her reflection in the kitchen's steel refrigerator door. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "The measure of a person isn't in what they have, but in what they're willing to give." She thought about her own empty apartment waiting for her, about the ramen noodles that would now be her Thanksgiving dinner. Somehow, the thought didn't bother her as much as she expected. The sky had darkened completely when Lucy finally pushed open the diner's back door, laden with bags. The snow was falling heavily now, the wind cutting through her coat like knives. Tom sat hunched on his bench, his military bearing fighting against the cold. "Tom," Lucy called out, her voice nearly lost in the wind. She saw him start to decline, his pride warring with his needs. But then something changed in his expression as he looked at her face. Perhaps seeing something of her grandfather's spirit there. "You shouldn't have," he began. But Lucy cut him off. "My grandfather always said that no one should be alone on Thanksgiving," she said firmly, setting down the bags, "especially not someone who served." As she helped Tom set up the meal under the shelter of the diner's awning, protected somewhat from the driving snow, Lucy noticed his hands shaking, not just from cold, but from emotion. When she pulled out the pumpkin pie, she saw him blink rapidly, turning away to hide his face. "Been a long time," he said quietly, looking at the spread of food. "Last proper Thanksgiving I had was with my unit in Saudi Arabia, just before." He trailed off, his hand unconsciously going to the dog tags hidden under his jacket. Lucy sat with him as he ate, sharing stories about her grandfather, about her dreams of becoming a nurse, about the way the first snow always reminded her of home. Tom listened, offering small snippets of his own life, careful comments about his training, about the brotherhood of the Marines, about a daughter he hadn't seen in years. As they talked, Lucy noticed something she hadn't seen before. When Tom reached for the cranberry sauce, his sleeve rolled up slightly, revealing not just the unit insignia she'd glimpsed before, but what looked like part of a Silver Star medal tattooed alongside it. Before she could get a better look, he quickly pulled his sleeve down, but not before Lucy caught a glimpse of a date inked below the medal, February 1991. The bitter wind howled around them, but in that moment, sharing a simple meal in the eye. Snow. Something profound passed between them. A connection forged through sacrifice and understanding. Lucy had given up her Thanksgiving dinner, but she had gained something far more valuable. A reminder of why she wanted to become a nurse, in the first place, to help those who needed it most. What Lucy didn't know was that her small act of kindness was about to set in motion a chain of events that would not only change Tom's life, but would ripple out to touch countless others. As they sat there in the growing storm, neither of them, aware of the approaching figure watching from across the street, destiny was about to reveal its hand in an extraordinary way. The day after Thanksgiving dawned bright and bitter cold. The storm, having left Millbrook, transformed into a glittering, white landscape. Lucy arrived early for her morning shift, her own Thanksgiving having consisted of cup noodles and leftover cookies from the diner. But her heart felt full, remembering the gratitude in Tom's eyes the night before. However, something was different this morning. Tom wasn't at his usual spot. The bench where he always sat was empty, covered in a pristine blanket of snow. Lucy felt a knot of worry form in her stomach. Had he been unable to find shelter during the worst of the storm? "He's okay," Maria reassured her, noting Lucy's concerned expression. "I saw him early this morning, walking toward the town library. Said something about needing to check the newspapers." Throughout her morning shift, Lucy noticed an unusual number of unfamiliar faces in the diner. First, there was a well-dressed woman who sat in the corner booth for hours, nursing a single cup of coffee while typing intensely on her laptop. She kept glancing out the window toward Tom's empty bench. Then came two men in crisp winter coats, their military bearing obvious to Lucy's trained eye. They ordered nothing but coffee and spoke in hushed tones, one of them occasionally speaking into a phone using what sounded like military jargon. "Echo 3, location confirmed," Lucy overheard as she passed their table. "Subject matches description. Waiting for visual confirmation." By early afternoon, Lucy noticed a sleek black SUV parked across the street, its windows tinted. The vehicle had government plates, and she could see someone sitting inside, watching the diner. The atmosphere felt charged with anticipation, like the air before a storm. "Something's happening," Beth whispered during their break. "Did you see the guy who came in earlier? The one with the Marine Corps pin? He was asking questions about Tom." Lucy's mind raced back to the details she'd observed. The Silver Star tattoo, the coordinates, the mention of Echo Company and the rescue mission. Who was Tom, really? And why were all these people suddenly interested in him? Around 2 o'clock, a distinguished-looking man in a naval officer's uniform entered the diner. Despite the busy lunch rush, the entire restaurant seemed to grow quieter. He sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and then did something unexpected. He turned to Lucy. "Miss Chen?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I'm Captain James Morrison, United States Navy. Might I have a word?" Lucy's hands trembled slightly as she poured his coffee. The captain waited until she had a break, then gestured to the empty seat beside him. "I understand you've been helping a homeless veteran," he said carefully, watching her reaction. "A man you know as Tom." Lucy felt defensive. "He's a good man," she said firmly. "Whatever you think he did." Captain Morrison held up a hand. "No, Miss Chen, you misunderstand. We've been looking for him for a very long time. Not because he's in trouble, but because he's a hero. One of the greatest I've ever known." He pulled out a folder, showing Lucy a faded photograph. In it, she recognized a younger Tom, standing proud in his Marine dress uniform, chest decorated with medals, including a Silver Star. "Sergeant Major Thomas Sullivan," Captain Morrison said softly. "Echo Company, 3rd Battalion. February 24th, 1991. He led a mission that saved 38 civilians trapped behind enemy lines during Operation Desert Storm. But that's not why we're looking for him." Lucy leaned forward, her coffee forgotten. The captain continued, his voice heavy with emotion. 3 months ago, his daughter, Captain Kelly Sullivan, took command of her own Marine unit. She's been searching for him ever since he disappeared after his wife's death 5 years ago. The trauma, the loss, it was too much. He gave away most of his money to veteran charities and just vanished. The bell above the diner door chimed. Lucy looked up to see the well-dressed woman from earlier returning, this time accompanied by Tom. The woman's eyes were red, as if she'd been crying. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent diner. "It's time to come home." What happened next would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come. But as Lucy watched the scene unfold, she realized that her simple act of kindness had done more than just help one person. It had bridged a gap that seemed unbridgeable, bringing a father back to his daughter, a hero back to his legacy, and hope back to countless others who would soon hear this story. The revelation of Tom's true identity unfolded like a scene from a movie, but with raw emotions that no script could capture. As Captain Kelly Sullivan stood before her father in her crisp Marine uniform, the resemblance between them was striking. The same straight bearing, the same determined set of the jaw, the same clear blue eyes now filled with tears. "Kelly," Tom whispered, his voice rough with emotion. His military bearings seemed to falter for the first time since Lucy had known him, his shoulders trembling slightly as his daughter stepped forward to embrace him. Captain Morrison stood, addressing the now silent diner. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've been in the presence of a true American hero. Sergeant Major Thomas Sullivan isn't just any Marine. His actions during Operation Desert Storm saved not just 38 civilians, but changed the course of an entire operation." Lucy watched as Tom, Sergeant Major Sullivan, straightened his shoulders, the familiar military bearing returning despite his worn clothes. Captain Morrison continued, pulling out what looked like an official document. "February 24th, 1991, he read. "Echo Company was conducting a routine patrol when they received intelligence about civilians trapped in a combat zone. Against direct orders to wait for backup, Sergeant Major Sullivan led his team through enemy territory. What happened next became classified for years." Tom's daughter picked up the story. her voice carrying the pride of both a Marine and a daughter. Dad never told anyone the full story, but the civilians weren't just refugees. They were international, aid workers and local families, including children. The intel suggested they had less than an hour before. She paused, composing herself. The official report said he carried 2 injured children 3 miles through a minefield. Lucy remembered Tom's limp, the way he favored his left leg. It all made sense now. The Silver Star citation reads, Captain Morrison continued, for exceptional valor and leadership in the face of extreme danger. But that's not why we're here today. Kelly took her father's hand. Dad, after Mom died, when you disappeared, I understood. The PTSD, the loss, it was too much. But giving away everything to veteran charities, vanishing without a trace. We've been searching for 5 years. Tom's voice was barely audible. Your mother. She was the strong one. After she was gone, the memories, the nightmares, they came back. Couldn't bear to be in that house without her. Thought everyone would be better off. No, Dad, Kelly said firmly. We weren't. The men from your unit, they never stopped looking. When I made captain, they all came to the ceremony, but the only person missing was you. That's when we intensified the search. The well-dressed woman who had been watching the diner stepped forward. A reporter from the Marine Corps Times, Lucy would later learn. She had been tracking the story of Echo Company's search for their lost leader, a story that had gained momentum when Kelly received her command. The foundation you established, the reporter explained to Tom, the one you funded with most of your savings before disappearing. It's helped hundreds of veterans. But they need more than money. They need hope. They need to see that even the strongest among us can struggle, can hit bottom, and can find their way back. Lucy stood quietly, by the counter, watching as more people entered the diner. Veterans from Tom's old unit, some traveling from across the country, had been converging on Millbrook ever since Kelly had received the tip about her father's location. They had waited, coordinating with Captain Morrison, wanting to be sure, before approaching their former leader. One by one they came forward, men who had served under Tom in Echo Company. Gray-haired now, some walking with canes, but all standing at attention before their sergeant major. The diner had become sacred ground, a place where past and present collided. Sir, one of them said, snapping a sharp salute. Echo Company reporting as ordered. Tom's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he returned the salute. At ease, Marines, he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. At ease. The story of what happened next would soon spread far beyond the small town of Millbrook. But in that moment, as Lucy watched Tom embrace his daughter and reunite with his men, she understood that her simple act of Thanksgiving kindness had done more than provide a warm meal. It had helped bring a hero home, had reunited a father with his daughter, and would soon inspire a movement that would touch the lives of countless veterans struggling with their own battles. What Lucy didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning. The real impact of her kindness was about to ripple out in ways that would transform not just Tom's life, but the lives of veterans across the country. The next few days in Millbrook felt like a whirlwind of emotions and activity. The small town diner had become the epicenter of a story that was rapidly capturing hearts across the nation. News vans lined the quiet streets, their satellite dishes reaching toward the winter sky like metal trees. Lucy arrived for her morning shift to find the diner already packed, not just with reporters and cameras, but with veterans who had driven through the night after hearing the story. They came from all over New England, drawn by the tale of the homeless hero and the waitress whose kindness had helped bring him home. Lucy, Maria called out as she walked in. Channel 5 wants to interview you, and the Boston Globe is on the phone. But Lucy's attention was drawn to a scene unfolding in Tom's usual booth. He sat there now, cleaned up and wearing proper winter clothes, his daughter Kelly beside him, Around them clustered members of Echo Company, their voices low as they shared memories and caught up on lost years. The transformation in Tom was remarkable, his posture still military straight, but his eyes now held a spark of life that had been missing before. "Tell them about the nursery school," one of his former Marines urged. "Sir, they need to hear that part of the story." Tom shook his head modestly, but Kelly picked up the tale. "During the rescue mission," she explained to Lucy, who had stopped to refill their coffee cups, "they found a makeshift nursery school in the combat zone. 20 children and 3 teachers trapped for days. Dad didn't just lead the rescue. He carried 2 injured children through the minefield himself, then went back for a third. The intelligence was wrong," Tom added quietly. "We were told we had an hour. Turned out we had 20 minutes before the artillery barrage would start. Couldn't leave those kids. Couldn't leave anyone." Lucy noticed how his hand trembled slightly. As he spoke, the memories still vivid after all these years. Kelly reached over and squeezed her father's hand, understanding in her eyes. Throughout the day, more stories emerged. Veterans from other units began sharing their own experiences of Tom's leadership. A former corporal drove up from Connecticut to tell how Tom had helped him get treatment for PTSD years after their service. Another veteran spoke about how the foundation Tom had established before disappearing had paid for his prosthetic leg. The reporter from the Marine Corps Times sat in the corner, frantically taking notes. Her article, which would run the following week, would describe not just the rescue mission that earned Tom his Silver Star, but the countless quiet acts of heroism that followed, the ways he had looked after his men long after they left the service. Around noon, Captain Morrison returned with more surprising news. "The Commandant himself wants to speak with you, sir," he told Tom. "And there's more. The Veteran Support Initiative you started with your savings, the Marine Corps wants to expand it nationwide. They're calling it the Sullivan Project." Lucy watched as Tom absorbed this information, his composure wavering slightly. "I don't deserve," he began, but Kelly cut him off. "Dad," she said firmly, "you spent 5 years punishing yourself, thinking you weren't worthy of help or connection. It's time to let that go. Look around this diner. Look at what your story is already doing." She was right. Lucy could see it happening before her eyes. Veterans in the diner were sharing their own stories now, opening up about their struggles with PTSD, about the challenges of returning to civilian life. Phones were coming out, numbers being exchanged, impromptu support networks forming over coffee, and Maria's maple-glazed donuts. A young Marine, recently returned from Afghanistan, approached Tom's table. "Sir," he said hesitantly, I've been living in my car for the past month. Couldn't bring myself to ask for help. But seeing your story, knowing that even a hero like you struggled." Tom stood immediately, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had once guided men through a desert storm. "Son, the first rule of being a Marine is we leave no one behind. That doesn't stop when we take off the uniform." He turned to Kelly. "Get him registered with the Foundation, now." Lucy realized that the diner had become more than just a restaurant. It was transforming into a sanctuary, a place where veterans could find understanding and support. Maria had already started a wall of photos near the entrance, featuring service members and their stories. The first photo was of Tom in his dress uniform, standing proud beside his unit in Saudi Arabia. As the afternoon wore on, more media arrived. But what caught Lucy's attention wasn't the cameras or the reporters. It was the quiet conversations happening in corners, the tears being shed, the healing beginning to take place. Veterans who had come to see a hero were finding something, perhaps even more valuable: hope. What no one knew yet was that this was just the beginning. The story of the homeless hero and the waitress's kindness was about to spark a movement that would change how America thought about and cared for its veterans. And it all started with a simple choice to share a Thanksgiving meal. Within a week of Tom's story breaking, the transformation of Millbrook and the Maple Grove Diner was nothing short of extraordinary. What had started as a local diner had become the heart of a growing movement. The parking lot now featured a large heated tent, donated by a local event company, where veterans could gather, share stories, and connect with support services. Lucy arrived one morning to find Tom already there, not on his old bench outside, but at what had become known as the Command Center, a corner booth where he, Kelly, and a team of volunteers coordinated what was rapidly becoming a nationwide veteran support network. "The Marines approved the expansion," Kelly announced, looking up from her laptop. "They're allocating $10 million to establish Sullivan Project centers in every major city, but that's not even the biggest news." She turned to Lucy with a smile. "Dad, tell her." Tom, now dressed warmly in a Marine Corps sweatshirt that one of his former unit members had brought him, cleared his throat. "The President called this morning. They want to use our story, your kindness, and what it sparked, as the centerpiece of a new national initiative for veteran mental health and housing support." Lucy nearly dropped her coffee pot. "The President?" "It gets better," Kelly added. "Remember that foundation Dad started before he disappeared? The one he gave most of his savings to? Other donors have stepped forward. The endowment just passed $50 million. Maria, who had been listening from behind the counter, wiped tears from her eyes. Her diner had already undergone significant changes. The walls were now covered with military photos and memorabilia, each telling a story of service and sacrifice. A new sign hung in the window. "Veterans always welcome. No one serves alone." But it wasn't just the physical changes that were remarkable. The spirit of the place had transformed. Every day brought new stories of hope and healing. A Vietnam veteran who hadn't spoken about his experiences in decades finally opened up after meeting Tom. A young female Marine struggling with PTSD found mentorship with Kelly. The diner had become a place where the invisible wounds of war could begin to heal. "Lucy," Tom called out during a quiet moment. "There's something else we need to discuss." He gestured for her to sit down. The Sullivan Project isn't just about helping veterans. It's about recognizing the people who help them. People like you. Kelly pulled out a document. "We're establishing a scholarship program, full ride to nursing school, plus a living stipend. You'll be our first recipient." Lucy's hands began to shake. I can't accept that. I just did what anyone would do." "But that's just it," Tom said softly. "Not everyone would. You saw past the homeless veteran to the person underneath. You gave up your own Thanksgiving to help a stranger. That's the spirit we want to encourage." Maria appeared with a fresh pot of coffee. "Tell her the rest," she urged, grinning. Kelly continued. "The scholarship is just the beginning. We want to establish a training program here at the diner, teaching medical students and nursing students about veteran-specific healthcare needs. Who better to help lead it than a nursing student who already understands the importance of compassion?" As Lucy tried to process this information, the diner's door chimed. A group of veterans entered, some walking tall, others leaning on canes or moving with prosthetic limbs. But what struck Lucy most was their eyes. These weren't the haunted looks she'd seen in Tom just a week ago. There was hope there now, and purpose. One of them approached Tom, snapping a crisp salute. "Sir, 1st Battalion just arrived from Camp Lejeune. The Commandant authorized our entire unit to support the Sullivan Project rollout. Where do you need us?" Tom returned the salute, then gestured to the maps spread across his table. "We're coordinating with VA hospitals in 5 states. Need teams at each location to help identify veterans in need and connect them with services. But most importantly, we need people who understand, people who've been there." Lucy watched as the diner filled with more veterans, each bringing their own stories, their own struggles, and their own determination to help others. The local news had taken to calling it the Millbrook miracle, how one small act of kindness had sparked a movement that was changing lives across the country. Maria had set up a special board near the entrance, tracking the Sullivan Project's impact. Veterans housed, 47. Veterans in treatment, 124. Lives touched, countless. The numbers grew daily. What amazed Lucy most was how the community had rallied around the cause. Local businesses donated supplies. The town council fast-tracked permits for a permanent veteran support center next to the diner. Even the high school students had gotten involved, organizing care packages for homeless veterans. "You know," Kelly said, watching Lucy take in the scene, "Dad always taught us that leadership isn't about giving orders, it's about giving hope. What you did, Lucy, that wasn't just kindness, it was leadership. You showed us all how to be better humans." The diner had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a beacon of hope, a symbol of what was possible when people chose to see past appearances to the humanity underneath. And this was still just the beginning. 1 month after that fateful Thanksgiving night, the Maple Grove Diner had become unrecognizable, in the best possible way. The small-town restaurant had transformed into what national media was calling America's first veterans haven, a model that cities across the country were rushing to replicate. "CNN wants another interview," Maria called out to Lucy one snowy morning. "And there's a film crew from PBS coming next week. They're doing a documentary on the Sullivan Project." Lucy barely had time to acknowledge the news as she navigated the busy diner. The original space had practically doubled, with the town council expediting permits for an expansion into the vacant storefront next door. The new space hosted counseling sessions, job training programs, and medical screenings, all specifically tailored for veterans. "Look at this," Kelly said, showing Lucy her tablet during a brief break. On the screen, a map of the United States glowed with dozens of bright points. Each light represents a new Sullivan Project Center being established. 37 locations already, and more coming online every week. Tom, who now split his time between coordinating the national initiative and maintaining a presence at the diner, sat at his usual spot, no longer outside in the cold, but in a warm corner booth that had become the unofficial command center for the entire operation. "Just got off the phone with the Secretary of Veterans Affairs," he announced as Lucy refilled his coffee. "They're implementing our peer support model nationwide. Every VA hospital will have a Sullivan Project coordinator by next year." But it wasn't just the big institutional changes that made the impact real. It was the individual stories that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Like the story of Mike Henderson, a former Army Ranger who had been living in his car for 3 years before finding his way to Millbrook. "I saw the story on the news," Mike explained to a documentary crew, "about Sergeant Major Sullivan and the waitress who helped him. Thought if a decorated Marine could ask for help, maybe I could too." Now Mike was one of the Sullivan Project's most effective peer counselors, helping other veterans navigate the transition back to civilian life. The diner's wall of photos had expanded into a full Hall of Honor, stretching through both the original space and the new addition. Each picture told a story of service, struggle, and redemption. But it wasn't just military photos anymore. There were pictures of the volunteers, the community members, and the countless small acts of kindness that had built this movement. "We got another letter from the White House," Kelly mentioned during the afternoon lull. "They want to establish a national day of recognition for veteran mental health awareness. They're calling it Sullivan Chen Day." Lucy nearly dropped her serving tray. "They can't. I mean, You just what?" Tom interrupted gently. "Just gave up your Thanksgiving dinner? Just showed kindness to a stranger? Just inspired a national movement?" He smiled. "Sometimes the smallest acts have the biggest ripples." The ripples were indeed spreading far and wide. Local businesses had started implementing veteran-friendly hiring programs. The community college had established a special scholarship fund for veterans and their families. Even the local high school had started a program where students could volunteer with the Sullivan Project, learning about service and sacrifice firsthand. Maria had transformed her hiring practices too. The diner now employed several veterans as staff, each wearing a small pin that identified them as military service members. It created an immediate connection with veteran customers who often found it easier to open up to someone who understood their experiences. "Watch this," Kelly said one afternoon, pointing to a scene unfolding by the entrance. A young veteran had just walked in, his posture tense, his eyes darting nervously. Before anyone else could react, one of the veteran servers approached him. "Welcome home, brother," the server said simply, leading him to a quiet booth. No pressure, no questions, just acceptance and understanding. The impact went beyond just veterans. Families affected by PTSD found support and understanding. Spouses connected with others who shared their experiences. Children of veterans met others who understood their unique challenges. The diner had become a hub of healing for entire families. "You know what the best part is?" Tom reflected one evening, watching the busy dinner crowd. "It's not just about helping veterans anymore. It's about showing people that everyone deserves a chance to be seen, to be helped, to be understood." Lucy thought about her own transformation. Her nursing studies had taken on new meaning as she learned more about veteran-specific healthcare needs. The scholarship from the Sullivan Project had relieved her financial stress, allowing her to focus on her true passion, helping others. "The governor called," Maria announced, joining them at the counter. "They want to use our model for other vulnerable populations. Imagine, Sullivan Project centers for homeless families, for at-risk youth, for anyone who needs a helping hand, and a warm meal." As the winter sun set over Millbrook, casting long shadows through the diner's windows, Lucy watched the diverse crowd that now filled the space. Veterans and civilians, young and old, all sharing meals and stories, all part of something bigger than themselves. What had started as a simple act of kindness had grown into a movement that was redefining how America cared for its veterans and for each other. But perhaps even more importantly, it had shown that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism aren't found on the battlefield, but in the simple choice to see and help another human being in need. 6 months after that snowy Thanksgiving night, Lucy stood at the podium of the newly constructed Veterans Support Center adjacent to the Maple Grove Diner. The audience before her included senators, military leaders, community organizers, and most importantly, hundreds of veterans whose lives had been touched by the Sullivan Project. "When I gave up my Thanksgiving dinner that night," Lucy began, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I wasn't thinking about starting a movement. I was just thinking about my grandfather's words about helping those who need it most. I was thinking about a man who sat in the cold every day, carrying a burden none of us could see." The transformation of both the diner and Millbrook itself had been remarkable. The Veterans Support Center, a state-of-the-art facility funded by private donations and government grants, now offered comprehensive services: mental health counseling, job training, medical care, and housing assistance. But more than that, it offered something that couldn't be measured: a sense of belonging. 6 months ago, Tom spoke next, his military bearing now matched by a renewed sense of purpose. "I was a lost soul, carrying wounds that no one could see. Today, I stand before you, not just as a retired Marine, but as living proof that it's never too late to come home." The statistics told an impressive story. Over 5,000 veterans housed nationwide, 12,000 enrolled in mental health programs, 3,000 placed in jobs, and 50 Sullivan Project centers established across the country. But the real impact could be seen in the faces of those gathered in the room. Mike Henderson, the former Army Ranger who had been living in his car, now directed the job placement program. "We don't just find them jobs," he explained to a group of corporate partners. "We help them find purpose again. Every veteran has unique skills, unique experiences. We help them translate that into civilian success." Kelly, who had taken leave from her Marine Corps duties to help establish the project, shared the latest developments. The Lucy Chen Initiative for Military Mental Health has been approved by Congress, she announced. Full funding for comprehensive mental health care for all veterans, with a focus on peer support and community integration. Lucy's nursing program had evolved as well. In partnership with the local medical school, she now led a specialized track for healthcare providers. Working with veterans, her experiences had shaped her understanding of not just medical care, but of human compassion. The thing about trauma, Lucy explained to her students, is that it doesn't just affect the individual. It ripples out to families, to communities. But here's the beautiful thing, healing ripples out too. When we help one veteran, we help their entire support network. The diner itself had become a model for similar establishments across the country. Maria had developed what she called the Open Door Protocol, a set of guidelines for creating veteran-friendly spaces in restaurants and businesses. The protocol emphasized understanding, respect, and practical support. It's not just about offering military discounts, Maria explained to a group of business owners. It's about creating safe spaces where veterans feel understood and welcomed. Sometimes healing starts with something as simple as a cup of coffee and a friendly face. Tom's daughter, Kelly, had become an integral part of the project's expansion. Her military experience combined with her personal connection to the cause made her a powerful advocate. What we're doing here isn't just about helping veterans, she told a congressional committee. It's about changing how we think about service, sacrifice, and healing. The impact on Millbrook had been profound. The small Vermont town had become a blueprint for how communities could support their veterans. Local businesses had embraced the Sullivan Project's mission, creating job opportunities and support networks. The high school had integrated veteran stories into its curriculum, teaching students about service and sacrifice firsthand. "Look at this," Tom said one evening, showing Lucy a map covered in lights. "Each light represents a life changed, a veteran found, a family reunited. And it all started because you chose to see me as a person, not just a problem." Lucy thought about her own journey, from struggling waitress to healthcare pioneer, from a simple act of kindness to a national movement. Her grandfather would have been proud, she knew, not just of her kindness that night, but of how she had helped turn that moment into lasting change. The Sullivan Project had become more than just a veteran support initiative. It had become a movement about human connection, about seeing past appearances to the worth and potential in every person. Communities across America were adopting the model, adapting it to help not just veterans, but anyone in need of support and understanding. As Lucy looked out over the gathered crowd, she saw not just the success of a program, but the triumph of human spirit. Veterans who had once been lost were now leading others home. Families torn apart by trauma were finding healing together. Communities were learning that strength comes not from ignoring problems, but from facing them together. What had started as one meal shared on a cold Thanksgiving night had grown into something that was changing the face of veteran care in America. But more than that, it had shown that the simplest acts of kindness could spark the most profound changes. 1 year after that fateful Thanksgiving night, the Maple Grove Diner hosted a special celebration. The parking lot was filled with cars bearing license plates from across the country. Veterans, families, community members, and officials gathered to commemorate what the media had dubbed the Millbrook Miracle. Lucy, now in her final year of nursing school, stood behind the counter where it had all begun. She watched as Tom, dressed in his marine dress blues for the occasion, shared stories with a group of recently helped veterans. His transformation was remarkable, not just in his appearance, but in the light that had returned to his eyes. "You know what I remember most about that night?" Tom said, addressing the gathered crowd. "It wasn't just the meal. It was the way Lucy looked at me, not with pity, not with fear, but with genuine compassion. Sometimes that's all it takes to help someone find their way back." The Sullivan Project had exceeded all expectations. What began as a simple act of kindness had grown into a nationwide network of support centers, each one following the model that had proven so successful in Millbrook. The statistics were impressive. Over 10,000 veterans housed, 20,000 receiving mental health support, and countless families reunited. Maria had expanded the diner's mission while keeping its heart intact. The wall of photos now extended through the entire restaurant, each image telling a story of transformation. Every picture represents a victory, she would tell visitors. Every smile represents a battle won. Kelly, who now divided her time between her Marine Corps duties and the Sullivan Project, shared the latest developments. "We're not just helping veterans anymore," she explained. "We're changing how America thinks about service, sacrifice, and healing. Every state now has at least one Sullivan Center, and the model is being adapted for other vulnerable populations." The diner had become a pilgrimage site of sorts. Veterans would travel from across the country just to sit in the booth where Tom had received his first meal, hoping to find the same hope and healing that he had found. Many stayed to help others, creating a continuous cycle of support and understanding. Lucy's nursing program had become a national model for veteran healthcare education. "The most important lesson," she told her students, "isn't in any textbook. It's about seeing the person behind the pain, the hero behind the hardship." As the celebration continued, Tom pulled Lucy aside. "There's something I want you to see," he said, leading her to the diner's entrance. There, newly installed, was a bronze plaque that read, "The Lucy Chen Legacy of Compassion, where kindness transforms lives." "But Lucy began, overwhelmed. "You just changed everything," Tom finished. "One meal, one moment of kindness at a time." The gathering stretched into the evening, with stories being shared over Maria's famous maple-glazed donuts and endless cups of coffee. Veterans who had once been lost now stood tall, sharing their own journeys of recovery. Families once torn apart by trauma now sat together, healing and whole. And through it all, the spirit of that first Thanksgiving night lived on. Every day, someone new would walk through the diner's doors, carrying invisible wounds, but finding visible hope. Every day, another veteran would find their way home. Another family would be reunited. Another life would be transformed. As the celebration wound down, Lucy stood at the counter one last time, looking out over the crowded diner. She thought about her grandfather's words about helping others, about the way a single act of kindness could ripple out to touch countless lives. She thought about Tom, once lost, but now found, and all the others who had followed in his footsteps. The Maple Grove Diner had become more than just a restaurant. It had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of human compassion, and a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. That's the thing about kindness. You never know how far it will reach, how many lives it will touch, or how many hearts it will heal. If you've been touched by this story of hope, compassion, and transformation, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with others who might need to hear that change is possible, that help is available, and that kindness still has the power to transform lives. Up next, we've got 2 more incredible stories that will warm your heart and restore your faith in humanity. Click above to discover more tales of extraordinary kindness and unexpected heroes. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us how this story touched your heart. Remember, sometimes the smallest act of kindness can create the biggest change. See you in our next story.